Hi guys, this is Erica from Gokce Capital.
Now before I begin, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications. In 1831, Samuel Ruggles went on a buying spree, purchasing 23 parcels of swampland just north of New York City. He had a plan. You see, the 1820s and 30s were a time of rapid change. That same year, New York's Board of Assistant Aldermen had noted that the population had grown by 60% in the preceding decade. Much of this growth was spurred by Irish and German immigrants who were forced into slums by a city that couldn't construct housing fast enough to meet demand. Meanwhile, and perhaps one of the first, but certainly not last, incidents of urban flight, the city's stuffy aristocracy began pushing into the rural hinterland to avoid the so-called unwashed masses. And in the swamplands just north of the city limits, Ruggles now identified opportunity. Though he intended to develop his newly acquired property, he also planned to preserve some of the land as a private gated park. The park would serve as an amenity, but it would also ensure that his wealthy buyers would remain insulated from future neighbors of a different class or race, since the park would keep surrounding property values astronomically high, and would also remain gated and restricted in perpetuity. But Ruggles didn't stop there. He also imposed conditions on the land to limit not only manufacturing, but also theaters and other public institutions, such as museums, further insulating his aristocratic buyers from the masses. Thus, a Gramercy Park was perhaps the first HOA in the United States. It certainly combines most of the major elements of today's associations, from the use of a corporation to maintain private infrastructure, to the adoption of restrictions, such as limitations on mobile homes or minimum home size requirements that restrict who can buy within the community or utilize its public spaces. No wonder HOAs spur strong feelings. In fact, in 1934, when a college student drove his car through Gramercy Park's iron fence, he was celebrated as a hero in local newspapers. But for every Gramercy Park, there is a Tierra Grande. Situated in the desert grazing lands just south of Albuquerque, Tierra Grande is the opposite of Gramercy Park in almost every way. But more on that later. For regardless of how you feel about HOAs, if you are buying property, you will have to contend with them. The estimates vary, but perhaps 18% of all homes in the United States and 60% of all newly constructed homes are on an HOA, so it's hard to avoid them. And in today's video, we're going to go over some of the top things that you should know about these controversial and increasingly prevalent institutions. Number 1. An HOA is a corporation formed within a specific community or neighborhood. It is made up of the community's residents and makes and enforces rules about properties within its jurisdiction. So it therefore serves as a kind of private government for a neighborhood or subdivision. Number 2. HOAs have mandatory rules, and these are codified in a document called the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, or more commonly, the CCRs. Almost every HOA will have CCRs, but the restrictions listed in the CCRs can vary dramatically. You may have some HOAs that essentially only require that properties remain free of trash or dangerous and unhealthy substances, and others that have pages of restrictions covering not only how the property may be used, but also how the property should look down to the paint color, and how the landscape should be maintained and presented. Some may even have restrictions on the kinds of pets that you can keep. And this is perhaps the greatest reason why many people try to avoid HOAs when purchasing land. Number 3. The HOA CCRs are mandatory, and non-compliance can result in fines. Severe non-compliance can even trigger litigation. So it's very important you understand the CCRs and all of their rules and regulations before purchasing property. Number 4. HOAs charge mandatory annual dues. Just as what is included in an HOA CCR can vary dramatically, so too can the amount charged by any individual association. Some HOAs have annual dues that are as low as $50. Others may charge thousands. It all depends on the location, the financial health of the association, and what kinds of amenities they are providing. But it's important to note that just as with the CCRs, annual dues are mandatory, and if they are not paid, a lien can be placed on the property. Number 5. HOAs can also charge special assessments. Unlike HOA dues, these are often one-time charges that are levied to pay for improvements or upgrades to community features. So when you're buying property, it's important to look up not only the annual dues, but whether any special assessments are currently being levied. If you own a property in an HOA, also make sure that you do not completely ignore any notices that the HOA sends. Otherwise, you may be surprised when your next bill comes in the mail. Number 6. Now, up until this point, you may be wondering why anyone would buy a property in an HOA, given the restrictions and the added fees that come with one. Having gone over some of the downsides of an HOA, it is very important to note that HOAs do have some real advantages. According to one report, properties in an HOA come with a premium of 4% on average. So property values do tend to be slightly higher. In addition, while the restrictions do place some limitations on what you can do with your property, keep in mind that these restrictions also apply to your neighbors. Thus, you know that your neighbor is not going to turn their property into a junkyard or otherwise keep it in an unsightly condition, as sometimes happens. HOAs also often come with access to amenities, such as open spaces, swimming pools, tennis courts, clubhouses, etc. This is, after all, why they charge annual dues, in order to maintain and provide such amenities. And these amenities are often one of the major selling points. And in rural areas, HOAs will often be the only way that a community can maintain and develop roads and other infrastructure. Number 7. If you are purchasing a property located in an HOA, make sure you do your due diligence not only on the property itself, but also on the association. At a bare minimum, you want to read the CCRs and all related organizational documents so you understand what obligations and restrictions you will be taking on when you purchase the property. When you go to visit the site, don't walk through only the property you are looking to purchase, but also all of the common areas maintained by the HOA. Their condition will be a good representation of how well the HOA is managed, as well as its financial status. Check any financial statements that you have access to. One of the biggest problems with an HOA stems not from the restrictions it imposes, but when it falls into financial mismanagement. When this happens, your annual dues will increase, all of the common areas and attendant infrastructure will fall into disrepair, and more special assessments may be levied. So you want to make sure that the HOA is in good financial health before purchasing in it. It may also be a good idea to speak with neighbors and residents, so you get a sense of how they feel about the HOA, and perhaps get some insight into how it's managed. How often do they go against property owners who commit slight infractions against the CCRs? How much do they impose in fines? How difficult are they to work with? In the same vein, it may be helpful to go to an HOA community meeting so you can see how the meetings are run and what the general relationship is between the HOA board members and the rest of the residents. But let's go back to our opening story. As I mentioned earlier, for all of the controversy that may be found in the history of HOAs, in some areas they do serve an often important role in maintaining infrastructure when a local government is unable to do so. And this brings me back to Tierra Grande. In the 1970s, the Horizon Corporation bought up thousands of acres of New Mexico desert grazing land. The land companies subdivided out their holdings and sold the newly created parcels to out-of-state investors, but never developed any infrastructure. Thus, most of the land remained undeveloped and uninhabited, with perhaps one exception. The Tierra Grande Improvement Association, representing property owners in the Tierra Grande subdivision, began a series of projects that involved bringing power to the subdivision, building a fire station, and blading out roads, among others. It thus created the conditions that allowed at least a few hundred people to live in the area. So the competing stories of Gramercy Park and Tierra Grande show the opposite ends of the spectrum of an HOA. In many instances throughout history, they have been created with the express interest of restricting who can live in a particular community, but other times they are a much-needed response to the lack of investment in infrastructure in a developing area. Either way, they are often a flashpoint in competing desires among property owners in a particular area. On the one hand, there is the notion that you should be free to use your property as you would like. On the other hand, there is the desire on the part of some property owners for well-maintained amenities and infrastructure. And regardless of how you feel about HOAs, you will have to contend with them as you are purchasing land. So do you have any stories about HOAs? Let us know in the comments. Did you like this video? You're going to love our Gokce Land Due Diligence program. We'll make you a land due diligence expert in just 7 days. Check it out at gokcecapital.com/glad. And while you're at our website, don't forget to explore our $1 down properties at gokcecapital.com/listings. Finally, don't hesitate to reach out with any questions. you can email, call, or text, and we will respond as soon as possible. So thank you for listening, and more to come.